Welcome to the Living the International Life podcast, where we discuss all topics from studying, working, and living abroad, and even language learning. And I'm your host, Jazz Cole, president and founder of Multilingual and Philanthropic Incorporated. Let's dive right in. Hello, it's Jazz here, your host of Living the International Life podcast. And I don't know if you guys can hear the fact that there's less of an echo because I moved since the last episode. So I am officially moved out of my parents' house. So finally, I can be like a real adult. And anyway, but so new environments and yeah, so today I really want to focus on language learning techniques because that is part of the international life. It's actually the most unavoidable part of the international life because depending on where you're going, if the country that you are going to is not a country that shares an official language that you speak, it's going to make life a little bit more challenging. The way I think of it is it makes life a little bit more fun because the thing is I love challenges and I love being in positions where I'm uncomfortable. I love being in positions, especially when it comes to language learning, where I actually can be out of my own comfort zone and actually learn something. I think the most important thing in life is to learn something. So I really want to just share my techniques of how to get around that. Just in the techniques of, I'm not going to go over specifically techniques in the detail I normally cover because I have some YouTube videos on that, which I will also link in the description. And basically just, I want to go over like the main things that I feel like we all should pretty much keep in mind when it comes to preparing to go abroad. It is not an easy thing. I know sometimes people are like, I know people who are just scared of traveling because they're like, I don't know, I'm very uncomfortable being in situations where I don't understand people, and that's perfectly normal. So I wanted to talk about just the main parts and breaking that down. So one thing I usually always talk about is how when we travel, specifically if you're studying abroad or you're working abroad where you're going to be forced to interact with people who don't speak your own language, I know that you can also come across misunderstandings because sometimes you may say things that don't always make sense in your language, but it does make sense to them. It doesn't make sense in your language, it makes sense to them and vice versa. And so you kind of have to kind of figure out ways to kind of get around that. And sometimes, you just have to laugh at yourself. It's like, yeah, I said that and it was not, I've said some things and they're like, Jazz, what you said was not what you were intending to say. And I'm like, oh, okay, thank you. It's like you have to learn to laugh at yourself because a lot of times we're afraid to speak to native speakers because we feel like they're going to judge us for not speaking perfectly. And I feel like that's just kind of complete BS. That's not the case at all. They really, in many cases, they will appreciate it. And anyone who says like, oh, you're not speaking it the perfect way, those are snobs and those are people you don't want to be around anyway. That's not a culture issue. That is a personality issue. So in the aspect of just kind of preparing is, first of all, is pronunciation. And I always say that this is the number one thing because you want to know how words are pronounced, how you can, because it's the aspect of pronunciation that's so important is to be clearly understood. Even when I teach my students, sometimes that they have pronunciation issues based on like they may have different accents. Like one of my students, she's actually Puerto Rican, and so sometimes I notice that Spanish comes out when she speaks, or it's like Spanish pronunciation of words that also cross over into Spanish. So a lot of times, you'll have those, and so I'm kind of like yesterday she was trying to say I want something. She's like je veux, and I said no, it's je veux. So, and we kind of had to work on that. And so she corrected that. But, sometimes you might have people crossing over from English pronunciation, especially when I'm teaching native English speakers, specifically Americans. I taught one guy who was from the north of England, and I remember having to kind of correct pronunciation a lot. So it really just depends on what accent you're coming from, and there's a chance that you just have to, especially like if you have a tutor, it makes it a lot easier because they can correct you versus when you're on your own, you're kind of having to match with other native speakers, like when you're listening and when you're hearing it, listening and speaking it. And so that's what I will just say on pronunciation. I think it's kind of funny when when I tell students, like beginners, because that's my specialty is at the beginner level, is I tell them, we're going to go over the alphabet. And it's like, I was like, yeah, I mean, I've noticed that for me, I thought like there were going to be a lot of students were going to be like, oh, like we're going to go over the alphabet. Like that's no. A lot of people are actually open to it because they're like, yeah, I probably need to know the alphabet because I feel like they're going to pronounce letters differently. And so I kind of like, that was something coming into teaching that I thought, oh my gosh, like people are going to think that oh, we're going back to kindergarten. No. And the thing is about it, a lot of times the alphabet is very brief. I go over it. I go through all the letters and then we go back through and I get them to repeat it. And then we go over accent marks. What do they do? How do they affect the letters? In certain ways, depending on the language, usually accent marks will have different purposes. In French, for the most part, their accents are just there to change pronunciation. Like they were there to say, this is how you pronounce this. Versus in Spanish, I noticed that accent marks are for emphasis. They don't really have any accent marks really. There's only like one, and I think it's an accent aigu kind of. And I think there's like very few words where they use like an umlaut or a diéresis in English, which is that little 2 dots. And I really don't see a whole lot else other than that. And then some languages, I know like in German, like they only have one accent. They have that umlaut or the diéresis with the 2 dots. And so that will change vowel sounds. I usually only see those over like an O, A, and a U. So a lot of times you got to understand that when we look at pronunciation, sometimes specifically accent marks, don't ignore them. Don't ignore accent marks because they do make a difference. And then, in Portuguese, I noticed that they have every accent mark under the sun, and it will change everything. So you really have to understand. I think that's very important because when you're reading things, especially if you're reading out loud, it makes it easier. Especially if you're using translation tools. Like I don't recommend Google Translate, but if you are desperate and you really need it, you can understand how to say it out loud. It's like you type it in and it comes up. This is what it means out loud for me to say it and repeat it to someone else. And so that makes a huge difference. So pronunciation is very important to be overall clearly understood when you are speaking. So the next thing I'll talk about is structure, because every language can sometimes have unique sentence structures. So like in English, we'll have sentences that have subject, verb, object. That's usually how it is. Like if you're, as an example, I ate lunch. I is the subject, ate is the verb, and then you have lunch, which is the object. It goes in that particular order. If you have languages like Spanish or Italian, where you just basically just take off the subject pronoun, basically like leo un libro, which is leo is the conjugated form of reading, like leer. And so when we conjugate that, we're conjugated in the first person. So leo, which is me. And then, but it's also I'm reading, or I read. And then un libro, which is the object. So it's basically like in those kinds of languages, it's like you're putting the subject and the verb together. then you have some languages like German where they will literally switch words all over the place. I feel like it's one of the most confusing languages because when I first learned it, I had to learn to think backward, like think with words switched. Like when you have two verbs in a sentence, like a modal verb or a helping verb, and then you have whatever the action verb is. So it's like if I wanted to say I will go to the park. So it's like ich würde beim Park gehen. So it was like I had to literally think I am to the park going. I had to constantly think, like when I was trying to, because now I don't really hesitate anymore because I've been speaking German since I was in college. So now it's like second nature. But I remember like when I first learned it, having to consciously, like make a conscious effort to think in how it's structured. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense to me, but I had to think about it in English. Like I had to change my own thinking of the structure of the English language. So like I said, I was thinking, I am to the park going. And I had to say it in English in that particular way so I can remember, okay, ich würde beim Park gehen. Like I had to think about it in order to make the correct sentence. Because like I said, some grammatical structures are not going to be the same. So sometimes I had to kind of convert that to English so I can make a response in German. So it's, and I remember having to teach German to a student of mine. And she was learning German because her husband was German. And so I remember trying to teach her the der, die, das, like all the articles in all three genders. Remember, there's three genders here. So you're looking at the fact that, like, again, having to figure out that there's three genders. And usually if you're coming from like a Latin-based language more than anything else, I'm just familiar with the two. Like, there's two things I have to remember. When I got to German, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's three things. And over time, I kind of got used to it because there are a lot of resources out there. I feel like sometimes people think that you have to pay. You could have to always pay for like things like Babbel or Duolingo or Duolingo you don't really pay for, but it is a service. And having these like paying for these apps that I honestly feel like don't really teach as effective. There's so many YouTube channels out there that teach. There's plenty of YouTube channels that teach the language in the target language, and I think that's the most effective. It's like really awful when you're a beginner and you're like, I don't know, and you would think that as a beginner you would be like, oh my gosh, this is so difficult. They're speaking to me in this language. But honestly, I feel like when you come into it with an open mind, you actually will learn it's very effective. There's an Italian YouTube channel that I love called Learn Amo. They teach Italian in Italian, and it's very visual. And they do a lot of little skits and things like that. So it really makes it easier for you to kind of visually understand what's going on. There's another channel that I love, Learn French with Pierre, and he actually teaches French in French. The YouTube channel is Easy Languages. They have there's easy French, there's easy Spanish. Like you can find they have several different affiliate YouTube channels based on different languages you're trying to learn. And it's so many languages too. It's not just like French and Spanish and German. They actually have so many different ones. And especially I know with Spanish, they have different hosts that are in different Spanish speaking countries. There's one who's always in Spain. And there's like several others who are in different countries like Argentina. You'll see them in like Mexico. You'll see them in, I think, what other one do I see them in? I think Uruguay. So you kind of have like that diverse aspect of those languages, the languages in which there are multiple countries that speak it. So I think you really need to have like you have to really pay attention to the structure. I think that's the next component, because it's really just important to know how can you build a complete sentence. I think that learning vocabulary is a waste of time unless you're learning it in the context of speaking it. So it's like instead of learning apple, man, girl, like you do in Duolingo, it's like I think you should learn those words in the context of how they would be used. Like seeing them used in sentences that actual native speakers would make, not like made up little sentences. Because sometimes when I go and I use Duolingo, I notice that like some things I get wrong. I'm like, I would never write it this way. I would never say it this way. Why are you saying what I'm saying the way I wrote it is wrong? That's not true. So you have to, I would say that those are resources that are like Duolingo is a starter, but I would say you want to make sure that you understand the structure of how to build a sentence before you even move forward. So the other thing I think is really important is integration. So it's like once you're kind of like learning how to pronounce words, structuring them, and then you're also learning to incorporate them, like using them and applying them. And it's really difficult to do that when you don't have outlets to integrate to. That's where integration in terms of how do you blend your your target language into your everyday life, so you constantly are seeing it and recognizing it all the time. One of the things I love doing is in the morning, I wake up and I do yoga. Or sometimes I'll do ballet exercises. Some days I'll do sometimes I'll do like just straight fitness videos overall. And I actually found YouTube channels that teach those things, that make those videos, but in other languages. And it makes it so much easier for me to be able to hear it and recognize it. And it's very visual because at the same time with most fitness videos, they actually have someone doing the action that they're talking about. It's not just someone giving you instructions. So it's always nice to be able to hear it and then you see what's going on. And then eventually your brain just gets used to it every time they hear something. And it's kind of like I said, how children learn their own native language. And I honestly believe that when you kind of have that integration and just like changing your phone into your target language, it makes a big difference. It's sometimes a really big challenge because you're sitting there thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not going to understand anything on my phone. And I'm like, well, your phone more than anybody else. So you just have to make sure you have really good translation tools. So I always recommend word reference, which is great because it allows you to understand words in the context of how of different contexts that they can be used. Then there's reverso context, which actually I found this particular translation tool through a YouTube channel. And what I noticed about it is that you can put full length things in there. You can translate full documents. I wouldn't do that. That's not my first inclination, but you can translate words more words in the context of like a sentence. I don't recommend Google Translate because what I've noticed is that they translate words literally. And so let's say if someone tells you a joke, you put it in Google Translate, you're going to be like, I'm so confused why you're saying that. And I'm like, you just didn't get it because the context that you were thinking of is not literal. The biggest example I use is like how in Brazilian Portuguese, there's like they have this phrase where they can call someone a stuffed sausage. I forget what the word was because I remember reading about it. It was like a stuffed sausage, and it's like confusing because if you put that in Google Translate, and I've done this before, when you put it in Google Translate, it's like, oh my gosh, like why are we talking about a stuffed sausage? But it doesn't give you the context to know that when they call someone a stuffed sausage, it means that they go on and on and on about nothing. It's like they're describing a person's characteristics. We're not literally talking about stuffed sausages. So when I give that example, like I said, you don't want to put everything into Google Translate because they're going to translate it literally. I will say they have great features if you're using them on your phone, like where you can put your camera up and it will translate it on your phone screen, and that's usually good. But then, like I said, but I wouldn't rely on that. That's like more of like a last resort, traveling and I need to read a menu or something that doesn't have a whole lot of nuances. And also I think of like how it's always a good idea to start watching foreign entertainment. And like one of the things I did was 2 years ago, I got a VPN, and it was great because I was able to find like free broadcasting channels. And they have like streaming online, and I was able to watch a lot of different shows and programming that I probably wouldn't have access to in my own country. So I strongly recommend a VPN. I think it's a great tool. And then on top of that, I was watching YouTube channels. I was trying to find ways to where I could get really good input. And then I had, and I also think that if you're in college, you should really try to reach out to international students, because I actually had a friend of mine who actually I met her because I met her actually after college, but I did have some friends in college who were international students, one who spoke French. I had one roommate who I met after college, and she was from Italy, and so I had a reason to learn more about her language and her culture, because I had someone who spoke it natively. And you can always, I think it's a great idea to find people. And the thing is that a friend of mine, and another friend of mine in California, when I was still going to school there, she said, "How are you meeting all these people? You're always talking about your friend from this country, this country." I'm like, "How are you meeting these people?" I'm like, sometimes they find me, I think in the way it's in the spiritual sense, sometimes if you seek, you find what you seek. If I'm looking for people to interact with people who are native speakers of another language, then I will find them. You know where to look for them. I met one of my good friends who is from France, and she has returned since. But she's from France, and we spent a lot of time together. And she actually was the one that encouraged me to be an au pair. And yeah, so that was an experience for her that she and I have really we kind of spent more time talking about, especially when I was going to make the effort to be an au pair. So I'm glad that we talked about that before that experience. So I think integration is very important. Like a lot of times there's clubs, there's places you may not even be aware of in your own hometown or anywhere nearby that actually is just a group of people just speaking. And I always recommend Bumble BFF, because it's so great, because you can find people in your area, and it's like, and they usually sometimes they'll put in the profile like little flags or like where they're from. And it's like, oh my gosh, they come from a country that speaks the language that I'm trying to learn. And it's really easy to connect on that. A lot of times I find people on Instagram who want to work on their English, and we just kind of do like a little language exchange. There's so many different ways to meet people, and I think that sometimes we just overlook it. We think that, I don't have anyone to speak with, and my hometown is small, and people don't speak it. There are people who speak it, you just probably don't know. And then I also want to talk about cultural aspects, because you need to understand the culture of the language that you're speaking. Language is a living, breathing thing that is a way of life for many people. And so when we look at how we can connect and it just really helps you kind of become more personally connected to the language. It kind of like gives you more skin in the game, so to say. So like for me, when I was learning about French culture, the more I learned about it, the more I realized that I am more French than I realized. I like some of the things that I remember reading and people watching videos of people who were experiencing culture shocks of having lived in Paris specifically. And they're like, yeah, like they enjoy having like coffee and dessert, like it's like at the end of the meal, it's like they end it with something sweet. And I'm like, I literally have a sweet tooth, and I love ending my meal with dessert. That's my thing, and a lot of times it's like very minimalistic, because a lot of times people were talking, when I was studying abroad, people were talking about how small like our little hotel apartment was, and I'm like, this is perfect. Another thing was I had a roommate, a bunkmate at that time, and so of course it kind of made it feel a little bit smaller, but I'm like, this is literally doable, because a lot of times they have aspects where it's like they're more minimalistically minded. So like with smaller spaces, it makes it a lot easier to not overbuy things, like when you have like, I had a roommate who took up like 80% of the closet because she had a lot of things, and she had like stuff from like Forever 21 and like H&M coming, like being delivered all the time. And I was like, oh my gosh. And I had like my little small section of things because I was actually at fashion school and I was making clothes on it, honestly. So I was just like, well, I don't really need to buy any more clothes because I'm already making them a whole bunch anyway. So, I mean, it's part of like the culture really gives you more of a connection to people. And I will say that, learning cultural aspects, you have to be careful about stereotypes because sometimes people may rely on stereotypes as kind of like a default when they don't know about certain cultures. But I just will say that, it's more about learning authentic aspects, like what is typical, but not like stereotypical. So like one of the things I learned is that, on the subway, you don't talk to people on the train. You just don't, because people will think like, oh, like, what do you want? And so if you're coming from a country where you're so used to people being friendly and just talking to people, which I'm from Kentucky, so it's very typical for us to talk to our neighbors and be really friendly. And I had kind of like an reacculturation shock because when I came back when I moved back to Kentucky from LA, I remember I was walking in my neighborhood and this guy like passed me and he goes, hey, how you doing? And I was like, oh my gosh, this guy spoke to me. And I'm like, Jazz, you were born and raised here. Don't act like you forgot your own culture. And so, so in other cases, like I think it's more common, like bigger city mentalities where people are not friendly. And I think sometimes when people get these aspects of like French people being rude, and the only place they've ever been is Paris, you're only getting a really like small snippet of that whole country because you don't know how people are in the French country. You don't know how they are in the South. You don't know how they are in the West or the East. France, I think for the most part, is a very vast country. And with any country, even in the United States, the cultures can be different across the United States. So I know Hawaii, their culture might be very different from people in New York, so you just really need to understand, like again, do your own research. Don't go to a country and just think, I'm going to go off of stereotypes and that's what I know. I found out in Paris, like I was so scared to order a coffee, like to go to a cafe or something, because I was just so terrified that they might get, because I found out there's actually a whole process of asking. There's a ritual. And I was still so confused about it. So I was like, I'm going to watch you do it. And I remember going to this cafe and I just was like, okay, whatever. So I ordered a tea. And I sat down and this guy was like, he's like, hey, they don't serve. So like you have to go over there, take it, and then sit down. I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, merci. I was like, so, like I said, I appreciate that person. God bless his soul. I'm so glad that he actually was nice enough to tell me that, because otherwise, there's some people who can just give you like looks and stares. I mean, I honestly think that French people can be friendly. It just helps a little bit more when you at least know something, something to go off of. And sometimes asking can even be, I think sometimes we underestimate asking questions. If we don't ask questions, we will never know, so that really helps. And I honestly think that, when you, specifically with learning, and it also kind of goes hand in hand with what I was talking about with integration and meeting people, is you like, especially if you're meeting people, you got to get a first-hand perspective of the culture. You can always ask them, especially if you have a relationship where you are comfortable being able to do that. So I think those are pretty much all the aspects. I think that kind of breaks it down into basically about I want to say 4 or 5 components. These are things that I do. I won't say that you have to do these things, but I just think this is going to give you the best results, because this is what has helped me with my relationships with when it comes to friends, even romantic relationships that I've had, and also my travel experiences. When it comes to mastering that. And I don't know, especially if you're a student and you're going abroad in your language of instruction, is not English or not whatever your native language is I think you really need to make sure that you're looking at what exams you're going to have to take, because a lot of times these exams, specifically like DELF or DAD, which is basically like language proficiency tests, depending on the language, is, they're not going to ask you, I feel like they're not going to ask you about how well you know how to conjugate things or how well you know how to how well you know certain vocabulary. They're going to actually be focused on how you can apply it. I think about, when I was taking the AP exam, it wasn't about like, oh, it's a vocabulary test. It's that how can you apply it? Do you really know this language frontwards and backwards, and like in terms of applying it? You don't have to know every idiomatic expression or every slang term, but you need to know how to conduct yourself in a way where you can clearly be understood. And as I will tell you through my own experience, it's inevitable, like it is unavoidable that you will make mistakes, and you may feel embarrassed about it, which honestly, I don't think you should. It's part of life, and you can't learn if you don't make any mistakes. So I hope this really gives you a good sense of how to really learn a language. Really, these are, like I said, these are things that I think are really major components to start with, because sometimes we're like, oh, I'm going to learn a language, let me go and do Duolingo. And you realize that, and over time it gets repetitive and you feel like you may not be learning a whole lot. And sometimes people give up because they're just like, I don't feel like I'm learning this language the way I want to. And it takes time. So these are components I would recommend you start with. And also check out our YouTube video on pronunciation made easy. And I have some other videos as well for language learning. Thanks so much for listening. Bye.